last video we were talking about what it was like for a soldier's life, where they would spend hours marching. They would be in these camps. They would be in a simple tent. It could be very cold in the winter, very hot, buggy in the summer. The type of food they had, this was a typical mess. You know, they would cook, if they could find things to cook, you know, a squirrel or something like that, you know, those were the pans they had with them, and how difficult their life was as a soldier. There were other effects besides taking away the right to a trial and the right to have evidence, habeas corpus. There was also, as the war went on and we have all these really high casualty numbers, a draft law should be posted instead of pasted, that required military service. By the end of the war, there was so many Southern men that were killed in battle that the draft for the Southern states, the ages ranged from 17 to 50. Your typical draft will run from 18 to maybe 35. And so they were really trying to get as many men, especially towards the end of the war, forcing them to fight. Both in the North and the South, if you were wealthy, you could get out of fighting. In the South, if you owned more than 20 slaves, you were exempt from fighting in the war because you had to manage the slaves and grow things and things like that. In the North, you could pay $300, and $300 back then was approximately what your average worker would make in a year. You could pay somebody $300 to get you out of the service, and they would serve for you, get you out of the draft. So there were a lot of other things going on with this. The war strained both economies. Now, the economy that was most effective was the Southern economy. The North handled it better. But in order to continue to pay for the war, there was levied the first income tax. Inflation began to rise terribly, especially in the South, when things went up 400%. And here's an example. In the South, at the beginning of the war, shoes could cost $18 in 1862, not even the beginning of the war. And by the end of the war, 3 years later, they would cost $800. The amount of supplies and things became so small because of that Anaconda plan. They couldn't import, and so if you had shoes, they were more and more valuable as the war went on. Nursing. With the high casualty rates, nursing used to be, honestly, mostly a man's profession. That the men would be the army nurses. At this time, they needed the men to go fight, so women became more and more enlisted as the nurses. And as a result, the Red Cross really was, Clara Barton, and the Red Cross was developed from the Civil War. And it's the idea of females becoming the nurses and establishing these organizations. So, by the end of 1862, you know, we've just kind of looked at how just a little quick look at the economy, a little look at how the working conditions, a little look at some of the legal things in terms of habeas corpus. So, you know, as we get to about midway in the war, what side was more successful? Well, the South was a little bit more successful. So, they had won more battles, even though they incurred terrible losses. And so Lincoln was like, what do I need to do? The amount of people, men that are dying, what it's doing to our economy, all these factors, he's like, we've got to end this war and restore the Union. And so Lincoln's last act to think, okay, we're waging war, what can I find, what else can I do, in a sense, to the South to end this quickly? And he decides, I am going to make a declaration as President of the United States that all slaves are free. Now remember, we talked earlier that out of the southern population, 1/3 of the potential population, and even if you look at the total population, realize a lot of that's women and children, so you have even a smaller group of men to choose from. But 1/3 of the total population were slaves. So Lincoln's like, if we can emancipate or set free, to emancipate means to free. If we can emancipate the slaves, that he realized that to preserve the Union meant everything. And he said if we could abolish slavery, emancipate, this makes the war over slavery, not preserving the Union. So he wanted to change the focus or the purpose of the war, because they weren't winning by saying the cause is to preserve the Union. So now he's like, well, let's make the war, the cause of the war or the importance of the war based on another factor too, and that would be the immorality of slavery, how it is wrong. And by doing that, by making it a slave issue as opposed to keeping the country, the Union together issue, his hope is that 1/3 of the southern population, the slaves, would now leave and fight for the Union, thus ending the war quicker and preserving the Union. So it was one of his things to preserve the Union. And so in his hopes to do that, let's change the focus of the war from do they have the right to leave the United States and create their own nation to